you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying. It is really a pleasure and an honor to welcome Brad Rosenstein here. Brad is a cultural historian, an exhibition curator. You've curated something like...
I've lost track. I think it's 8 or 9 exhibitions.
Different exhibitions about Noël Coward. He's one of the directors of the Noël Coward Archive, happens to be a Bay Area resident. And so welcome. I'm so glad
Thank you.
had a chance
Thank you. It's
to,
great to be here.
to talk about the film. So, as somebody who has taken the deep dive into the Noël Coward world, I'm curious, you've seen the film before just on your laptop, and now watching on the big screen. Does it capture him? Are there things that you yourself were surprised to see or to hear? What's your response to it, just to the film?
Well, I've been working on Coward in various forms for the past 16 years.
Wow. Yeah.
And so I've
done. Is that better? Can you hear me? Okay. For about 16 years, and I knew a lot about his work even before I started doing that. But then after multiple exhibitions that have been done here, LA, New York, London, I've done dozens of presentations and live events related to Coward, so there's not a lot that comes as a shock. But what is wonderful about this is seeing this in front of an audience and hearing your reactions and feeling your reactions to him. There is something that even in this old archival footage that comes alive in this man. There was something really magical about his presence. It comes across. I've met so many people who knew him during his lifetime, who saw him perform, and 50, 60 years later, they're still radiant from that experience. When we opened a version of the Star Quality exhibition in LA at the Motion Picture Academy, one of the guests that night was Anne Rutherford, the great movie actress who worked with Clark Gable and Vivian Leigh and John Wayne and Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland. And she put her arm around me and she said, "Honey, I've been in this business since 1935. The only man I ever asked for his autograph was Mr. Noël Coward. He was stunning." And you could see she still felt that all those years later. She met him in the 30s. So it's wonderful to be able to see it in this kind of venue and see it with an audience and feel that kind of reaction to him. That's always special.
One of the things that I like about the film is you get to hear the voices of some of the people who worked with him and who knew him, and they're really, the audio is really clean. I'm saying this as a documentary maker, listening and thinking, were any of these interviews done while these people, for this film while they were alive, or are these all archival audio from other interviews? For example, Peter Max, are there people that they interviewed in a typical documentary fashion that just chose to keep off camera?
This was really interesting to me. I have to emphasize, I had no formal role in making this film. I got introduced to the director, Barnaby Thompson, when he was at the very beginning of his process. And I just tried to offer up, because I've been someone who has spent so many years in the archives in this country and in the UK, I knew where all the Coward bodies were buried. And I knew where the good stuff was and things that people might overlook because they've been scattered to so many different places. So it was really to advise him on that, and I was very happy to see that some of that was made use of in this film, including Gertrude Lawrence's wonderful scrapbooks that have almost never been seen, get seen here, I think, for the first time. But I was also noticing that so many of these interviews actually came from other documentaries, because so many of these people are no longer with us, but they were very much alive when they were earlier versions. There was a brilliant documentary that was done on Noel's centenary in 1999 by the BBC called the Noël Coward Trilogy. And if you haven't seen it, check it out. It's available out on DVD, and it's a really wonderful film that is very interesting in comparison with this one. But many of the interviews that you hear from people who had worked with Noël are actually drawn from that documentary and reused here.
What would you say is the special quality of this? That if you're going to put back to back all of the work, the biographies and so forth, what do you feel is the special contribution or summary or emphasis? I mean, it's clearly very queer tilted. You've got both Alan Cumming and Rupert Everett sort of lending their queer out talents as British performers I find this all very touching. 50 years after Noël Coward, you have now this incredible lineage of talented gay queer actors who are now kind of representing him in an out way that he could never be in life. You've got Adam Lambert, a wonderful So I'm wondering, like, in the panoply of Cowardiana, what stands out right now about this film's contribution?
Well, I think it's definitely, first of all, the gay content. I mean, it was definitely addressed very openly in that previous BBC documentary that I mentioned, but it was much more in the background of the time. I think it's really difficult in San Francisco in 2024 to summon up the kind of world that Coward grew up in as far as his sexuality is concerned. He was born in 1899. He was born in the Victorian era. And that's something that, having been born in the previous century, was something he never forgot. It was a very important part of his character, as much as the very modern 20th century guy, there was also a 19th century guy. And he grew up very much in the shadow of Oscar Wilde's trial and imprisonment. He worked in the early theater. He began as a boy actor in a boarding theater with people who had worked with Wilde and knew that world. He saw the devastation of what happened and that occurred, and that continued throughout his life. Homosexuality was illegal, a prison offense in England until 1967, which was almost the end of Noel's life. His friend John Gilgood had served jail time for being outed. So this was a very real fear. This was a very real shadow that existed at that time, and I think it's hard for us to kind of cast ourselves back to that. At the same time, he never kept it a secret. In that previous BBC documentary, there's a wonderful moment with his late secretary, Joan Hurst, where she said, everybody knew and nobody cared. And that was the environment within the theatrical world of London. That was certainly true. It was a stumbling block in a much bigger sense, in a political sense, and especially when he started getting involved in those worlds. Also, his background as a spy, which was very little addressed in previous work on this. And I think there's a great full film you could make about that, because so much of this stuff has been buried for so long, so much of it was contained by the Official Secrets Act. Even Noel himself couldn't talk about it. And there was so much very interesting work that he did, very valuable work that he did as a spy that never got acknowledged. He actually made, in that summer of 1940, 3 visits to the White House to talk with Roosevelt. And many people feel that those visits were pivotal in the United States eventually supporting Britain in the war. There was a lot more to this man than has been acknowledged.
That's a completely fascinating aspect of his life that I knew nothing about. Let's get some questions. We'll go here first. Yes.
Yes. It turns out my own father was born in Liverpool in 1899. And he served in World War I and came to America. And I see some similarities and very different men, but there's a reason why so many people left Britain after World War I.
Let's get a question that I can speak for you to Brett.
The war had been won, but at a great cost. It was a Pyrrhic victory in many respects. And this shows it very well. It's really brilliantly done.
Okay, so that was a comment praising how well done the film was for finding its era. Yes, please.
So what's really interesting about the documentary is everybody knew, but no one talks about it. I mean, there's not a lot of comment in the documentary about him being gay. And I'm curious, did anybody talk about it, like his excellence? Did anybody write about it?
So the question is, did anybody talk or write during his lifetime about his being, or after about his being gay, or is that probably just getting that?
Including his mom, did his mom know?
Oh, his mom definitely knew. And his mom, I mean, she lived with him throughout most of his life. That where he talks about getting her out of the kitchen and into a secure life. He took incredible care of both his parents throughout their lifetimes. They lived with him in his country house in Kent. She was very welcoming to all of his partners throughout that time, and to the whole gay circle that surrounded him. And it was a very wide and broad queer community that he was a part of internationally. Because of his connections to New York, his connections to Hollywood, his connections to the UK. And many of those folks within their circle could be very open and knew exactly what was happening. But to admit that publicly in the world that they grew up in was a much, much harder thing to do. But it's very much talked about. His partner Graham Payne wrote a book about their partnership, and that's, it's made clear what's happening. What was fascinating to me in researching this, the last big exhibition I did on Noel was really about, it was called Noël Coward Art and Style, and it was talking about the whole importance of fashion and design in his life and his work. And there were, because he set trends even in how he lived his life, how his homes were decorated even, there would be these major spreads in the equivalence of their architectural digests of their day about his homes, his studio in London, his country house, his apartment in New York, that very openly, and this is in the 1930s, talk about him living with his best friend and business manager, who was also in charge of the decorating in the house. There is not one wink, there is not one comment on this. It's presented very matter-of-factly in each of these articles, and I find that fascinating, that these are mainstream publications that are openly acknowledging this and making no notice of the fact whatsoever. It's taken as given.
It's almost, I think, too early in sort of out queer gay life to even be acknowledged that way. Many of you saw, I think last year, it was one of the Rock Hudson films that Fairmont has shown over the years, and Rock Hudson lived obviously into the AIDS era, in which case it was also through gay liberation. And so once gay people, I think ourselves, turned the spotlight on ourselves and said we're here, it was harder for the generation of Noël Coward to actually remain in the closet without being called out. And he died in 1973, which is really just the very, very, very earliest moments of open gay liberation.
Indeed. Yeah.
More thoughts or questions? Yes, right here.
Who blocked his knighthood the first time and why?
Who blocked his night?
Wow,
first
that's
time and
an
why?
interesting question in itself. It's something I've actually done a lot of research on. And unfortunately, I think to get a definitive answer is almost impossible at this time. But I think there were a couple of strands that were really important. I think one of them is he really made some mistakes in talking to the press during this period, especially when he was starting to do his work for the British government. Not only that comment about the sniveling boys from Brooklyn, but he made a lot of critical comments about what was happening in the politics between the US and the UK at that time. Even prior to the war, he had really rattled the cage of Lord Beaverbrook, who was the media mogul. He was kind of the Rupert Murdoch of his day, very conservative, and Noël was not at that time, and really had the power of the Beaverbrook press against him prior to this. This man wielded enormous power over many of the British politicians who would have been in the position of granting Noël that knighthood, getting him official permission. It was Winston Churchill who actually signed the note that went to the king saying, we should not do this. And so he's often taken the rap for it, but I suspect there were many other pressures on Churchill that went beyond his own feelings about Noël, because they were actually friends. But I think he felt like if we do this, it's going to put all of us in a very compromised position. And I think people put a lot of emphasis on his homosexuality as being a reason, and I think it's much less. But there's one thing that wasn't mentioned in this film, which it's long been rumored that he had a long affair with George, the Duke of Kent, who was actually part of the royal family. And there is a lot of speculation that the blocking of the knighthood was related to that relationship. George died in a plane crash the very year that that knighthood was being considered, and that would have been the end of their relationship. So a lot of people think that had something to do with it as well. But it's very difficult to tease out what that reason was.
Wow, that was intrigue.
Yeah, a lot. That's another film in itself.
It is part of that. Maybe that's in the future. We've kind of run out of time because we've got another film coming into the theater. Maybe we'll take a moment outside and